Donald Trump just lost Canada. Not diplomatically, not rhetorically, structurally, permanently. At least that is the unmistakable message delivered by Mark Carney in a declaration so sweeping, so deliberately constructed, and so strategically timed that sources inside 3 separate G7 governments described it within hours as the most significant realignment of North American energy architecture since the 1973 oil crisis. Carney did not threaten energy independence from the United States. He declared it, past tense, done, effective, and he backed that declaration with specific policy instruments, specific market redirections, and specific international partnerships that signal with unmistakable clarity that Canada has made a sovereign decision to restructure its energy relationships at the foundational level. Trump reacted. Of course, he reacted. And the way he reacted, the specific language, the specific threats, the specific timeline told you everything you need to know about whether the White House understood what had just happened to them. What is unfolding right now is not a trade dispute. It is not a tariff negotiation. It is a fundamental restructuring of North American energy geography that will affect American electricity prices, American natural gas supply, American industrial competitiveness, and American foreign policy credibility for years, possibly decades to come. When a Prime Minister of Canada stands before his Parliament and uses the word independence in the context of energy supply and the markets in New York, London and Tokyo move within minutes. This is not a political speech. This is a strategic declaration with operational consequences. Hit that subscribe button right now because you will not want to miss a single video I release on this developing story. The implications reach into every American home that pays an energy bill. So, what exactly brought this moment to a head? On March 17, 2026, Mark Carney appeared before a joint session of the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa and delivered what his office had pre-described only as a major address on Canadian economic sovereignty. No advance text was provided to journalists. No diplomatic preview was offered to allied governments. No briefing was given to the American Embassy in Ottawa or to the State Department in Washington. Multiple sources describe the deliberate information blackout as itself a message, a signal that Canada was done consulting Washington before making sovereign decisions about Canadian resources. The address lasted 41 minutes. By the time Carney sat down, he had announced a comprehensive Canadian energy independence framework, a 7-point policy architecture that his office formally titled the Sovereign Energy Declaration of 2026 that redirected Canadian energy export policy away from the United States as the default primary market and toward a diversified portfolio of international buyers, infrastructure, investments, and regulatory structures designed to ensure that no future American administration could use energy dependency as either a pressure point against Canada or a demand instrument in bilateral negotiations. This is not just another political controversy. Canada supplies approximately 60% of American crude oil imports, provides natural gas to millions of American homes in the Northeast and Midwest, and delivers hydroelectric power through long-term contracts to American states, including New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota. The country that Trump has repeatedly suggested should become the 51st state of the United States just announced it is building an energy future that does not center the United States as its primary customer. And believe me, when the Prime Minister of your largest energy supplier declares independence from your market, you know something historic has just permanently changed. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions over energy had been building since February 2026, when Trump's repeated suggestions that Canada should accept American terms on trade and governance were accompanied by increasingly explicit references to Canada's energy exports as, in Trump's words, something America could replace if it had to. Those references alarmed Canadian energy policy experts, not because they were credible in the short term. Replacing Canadian crude oil and natural gas supply to the American Northeast and Midwest within any realistic time frame is, as multiple energy economists have noted, logistically impossible. But because they signal that the Trump administration viewed Canadian energy supply as a lever rather than as a mutual interdependency. Canada draws a fundamentally different conclusion from that interdependency than Washington apparently does. But everything escalated on March 12th, 2026, when a White House economic briefing described by three sources familiar with its contents to Reuters and the Globe and Mail outlined a scenario in which the United States would use the threat of energy infrastructure investment in alternative supply sources as a long-term negotiating instrument against Ottawa. That briefing, once its existence became known in Canadian government circles, reportedly produced what one senior Canadian official described as a clarifying moment. If Washington was prepared to discuss weaponizing energy supply chains as a bilateral pressure tool, then Ottawa needed to ensure structurally and permanently that Canada's energy export relationships were diverse enough that no single buyer, including the United States, held veto power over Canadian energy policy. Carney's team had been working on the framework since January. March 17th was the day they chose to deploy it. Smash that like and subscribe button right now if you are beginning to understand the full scope of what just happened. And here's where it really gets serious. The 7 points of the Sovereign Energy Declaration were not symbolic. Each one was a specific policy instrument with specific economic consequences for specific American stakeholders. Sources inside Canada's Natural Resources Ministry described the framework as deliberately sequenced, ordered not by economic magnitude, but by political impact, with the measures most likely to generate immediate American industry reaction placed first to ensure that the response apparatus in Washington was flooded with incoming calls from domestic constituencies before Trump had time to formulate a public reaction. The first point was the announcement that Canada would accelerate construction of the Energy East Pipeline Corridor, a long-discussed east-west pipeline project that would allow Alberta crude oil to reach Atlantic tidewater at Street John, New Brunswick, from which it can be exported to European and Asian markets without transiting American territory at any point. The project had been shelved in 2017. Carney announced federal regulatory fast-tracking and an initial capital commitment of 14.7 billion Canadian dollars. American refiners in the Midwest who depend on Alberta crude delivered through existing north-south pipeline infrastructure registered the announcement immediately. The second point was a formal framework agreement with the European Union signed in Brussels 2 days earlier on March 15th, but embargoed until Carney's parliamentary address establishing Canada as a priority liquefied natural gas supplier to European markets through a new LNG terminal to be constructed at Goldberg, Nova Scotia. The agreement included guaranteed purchase commitments from Germany, the Netherlands, and France, totaling 12 billion cubic meters of Canadian LNG annually by 2031. The EU had been seeking to diversify away from Russian gas dependency since 2022. Canada had been reluctant to commit to the capital investment required for LNG export infrastructure. That reluctance, Carney made clear, had now ended. The press gallery in the House of Commons chamber was silent for a full 4 seconds after that announcement. The third point was the suspension of preferential pricing arrangements that had historically governed Canadian hydroelectric power sales to American northeastern states. New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota had all benefited for decades from long-term power purchase agreements with Hydro-Quebec and other Canadian provincial utilities that provided reliable, low-cost electricity at rates below what American domestic generation could match. Carney announced that those agreements would be reviewed for renegotiation at market rates and that new capacity would be offered first to Canadian industrial users and second to international buyers, with American state utilities moved to a competitive bidding process rather than a preferential arrangement. The governors of New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota received that news through their energy departments before Carney had finished speaking. Sources described the calls that followed as urgent. The fourth point was the establishment of a Canadian Critical Minerals Sovereignty Reserve, a regulatory framework giving the Canadian federal government authority to review and restrict export permits for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements when export patterns are deemed to conflict with Canadian national economic interests. This was not a new idea. The framework had been discussed in Ottawa policy circles since 2023, but formalizing it as a component of the Sovereign Energy Declaration gave it a weight and a permanence that went far beyond previous regulatory discussions. American defense contractors heard that announcement and reached for their phones simultaneously. The fifth point was a series of bilateral energy cooperation agreements with Japan and South Korea, two of the world's largest LNG importers, formalizing Canadian natural gas supply, commitments through new Pacific-facing export infrastructure in British Columbia. The agreements have been in negotiation since late 2025. The timing of their announcement as part of the Sovereign Energy Declaration was deliberate. Canada was not just redirecting energy away from the United States. It was simultaneously anchoring new supply relationships with American strategic allies in the Indo-Pacific, using the same resources that the Trump administration had apparently assumed would remain indefinitely captive to the American market. The sixth and seventh points addressed internal Canadian energy market restructuring and provincial coordination mechanisms that had primarily domestic implications, but their inclusion in the framework signaled that this was a comprehensive, institutionalized policy shift rather than a set of reactive measures that a future government could easily reverse. By the time Carney finished speaking, Canadian energy stocks had surged. Alberta oil sands companies, whose product had been in search of new markets for years, saw share prices jump 6 to 9% on the TSX. LG infrastructure companies rose sharply. Provincial energy ministers from British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec were publicly endorsing the framework within the hour. This moment did not arrive without historical precedent, but the precedents that come closest are more alarming than reassuring. Think back to 1973, when Arab OPEC members imposed an oil embargo on the United States in response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The embargo lasted 5 months, triggered gasoline shortages across the American Northeast and Midwest, produced lines at gas stations that Americans over 65 still remember viscerally, pushed crude oil prices up 300%, and contributed directly to the worst American recession between the Great Depression and 2008. The United States did not control its energy supply in 1973. It was dependent on foreign producers who had decided that the relationship required rebalancing. Canada is not OPEC. Canada is not imposing an embargo. Canada is doing something in some ways more consequential. It is constructing permanent alternative infrastructure and permanent alternative market relationships that will reduce American leverage over Canadian energy policy, not for months, but for generations. The Energy East pipeline corridor, once built, does not get unbuilt. The LNG terminal at Goldber, once constructed and operational, does not close because an American president changes tone. The supply agreements with Germany, Japan, and South Korea, once signed and operationalized, do not disappear because Washington asked nicely. Then there was the Nixon-era project, Independence of 1973. The American government's own response to energy vulnerability, a recognition that dependence on foreign energy supply creates strategic risk that no amount of diplomatic goodwill fully insulates against. Nixon's program ultimately failed to achieve American energy independence, but its underlying logic was sound and is directly applicable to the current situation. From Canada's perspective, Canada has watched its energy resources become a pressure point in American bilateral negotiations. Canada has concluded that diversifying away from that dependency is both economically rational and strategically essential. This is not emotionally driven retaliation. This is strategic rationality. Daniel Yergin, vice chairman of S&P Global and the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Definitive History of the Global Oil Industry, told CNBC on the afternoon of March 17th that what Carney announced represents a fundamental restructuring of North American energy architecture. He noted that the combination of Atlantic LNG export capacity, Pacific LNG framework agreements, and European supply commitments means Canada is, for the first time in its history, genuinely constructing the infrastructure required to be a global energy exporter rather than primarily a continental one. He added that the implications for American energy pricing, particularly in the northeastern states that depend heavily on Canadian natural gas and hydroelectric power, deserved far more serious analytical attention than they were receiving. Don't go anywhere, because what Trump did next and what it revealed about the West Wing's understanding of what had just happened is the most explosive part of this entire story. Trump's reaction came at 2:34 p.m. On March 17th. a Truth Social post that read, in its entirety, Canada just made the biggest mistake in their history. We don't need their energy. We have more oil and gas than anyone. I will impose immediate 50% tariffs on all Canadian energy products, effective in 30 days unless this ridiculous declaration is reversed. Carney is a fool. He will regret this. America first, always. The post was accompanied by a separate statement from the White House press office issued 12 minutes later confirming that the president was directing the Department of Energy and the Office of the United States Trade Representative to begin immediate preparation of tariff instruments applicable to Canadian crude oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power imports. Energy markets reacted within minutes, but not in the direction the White House apparently expected. American natural gas futures spiked 5.7% within the first hour of trading after the Trump post. Heating oil futures moved sharply upward. Utility stocks serving the American Northeast companies, whose customers depend on Canadian energy supply, fell between 3 and 7%. The reason was straightforward, and to anyone who had studied the energy supply geography of the American Northeast, entirely predictable. Threatening tariffs on Canadian energy does not reduce American dependence on Canadian energy. It raises the cost of that energy to American consumers and businesses while doing nothing to change the underlying supply reality, which is that the infrastructure to replace Canadian supply does not exist and cannot be built in 30 days or 30 months. This puts the administration in an extraordinarily difficult bind that energy analysts described with unusual anonymity as self-constructed. On one side, following through on the 50% energy tariff threat means imposing significant cost increases on American energy consumers, particularly in the northeastern states that depend on Canadian natural gas for home heating and on Canadian hydroelectric power for electricity. In states that include New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, home heating costs rise, electricity bills rise, industrial energy costs for manufacturers rise. The political feedback from those cost increases registers in exactly the states where Republican political fortunes are most marginal. On the other side, not following through, backing away from the tariff threat after making it publicly and specifically means demonstrating that the threat was empty, which further erodes the credibility of American economic pressure as a tool of bilateral diplomacy. Canada, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and every other government that received a communication from Washington this year will have noted that the threat was made and not executed. The leverage diminishes. The deterrent effect collapses. Legal and political analysts are describing the Sovereign Energy Declaration as the most consequential single policy announcement by a Canadian government in the context of American relations since the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement of 1988. Michael Ignatieff, former leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and former director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University, told the BBC on the evening of March 17th that what Carney has done is create facts on the ground that cannot be undone by a tariff threat or a Truth Social post. He noted that the infrastructure commitments, the European supply agreements, and the Pacific Framework deals are binding policy commitments that will generate their own political constituencies, Canadian energy workers, Canadian infrastructure companies, Canadian provincial governments who will resist any future reversal as strongly as they are now supporting the declaration. Even within American energy industry circles, the reaction to the Carney Declaration was more complicated than a simple alignment with the Trump tariff threat. The American Petroleum Institute, which had supported the administration's prior trade actions, issued a statement on March 17th that pointedly declined to endorse the 50% tariff threat and instead called for immediate bilateral negotiations to stabilize energy supply relationships. The statement noted that American refiners in the Midwest had constructed their processing infrastructure specifically to handle Canadian heavy crude, and that replacing that supply source was not operationally feasible within any politically relevant time frame. So let's break down the specific American vulnerabilities that the Sovereign Energy Declaration has exposed and that the tariff threat, rather than addressing, actually amplifies. First, northeastern home heating. Approximately 4.8 million American households in New England and the mid-Atlantic states depend on natural gas that originates in Canada or Transit's Canadian infrastructure. A 50% tariff on Canadian natural gas does not create alternative supply. It creates a 50% cost increase on the same supply. Home heating costs for those households rise immediately and significantly. The political geography of those households includes states that are marginal in national elections. Governors in those states are not going to absorb that cost increase silently. Second, Midwest industrial energy. Canadian hydroelectric power and natural gas supply flows into the American Midwest. Support industrial manufacturing operations in states from Minnesota to Ohio. Energy-intensive industry, steel, chemicals, automotive, food processing depend on competitive energy costs for their profit margins. A sustained 50% tariff on Canadian energy inputs raises those costs directly and reduces the competitiveness of American manufacturing against international competitors who do not face the same energy cost burden. This is the opposite of the economic nationalism the administration is committed to delivering. Third, the defense and technology supply chain. Canada's announcement of the critical minerals sovereignty reserve was embedded within the energy declaration but carries independent significance for American national security. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements are essential to the manufacture of electric vehicle batteries, military electronics, advanced weapons systems, and semiconductor components. American defense contractors and technology manufacturers who depend on Canadian critical mineral supply are now operating in a regulatory environment where export permits for those materials can be reviewed and restricted at the Canadian federal government's discretion. The Pentagon has noted this. The defense industry has noted this. Several congressional committees have now requested classified briefings on the supply chain exposure. But beyond the immediate energy pricing and supply chain implications, this is really about something that will outlast the current administration, the current Canadian government, and the current cycle of bilateral tension. It is about whether the geography of North American energy, the pipelines, the terminals, the long-term contracts, the market relationships gets permanently restructured during this window of confrontation in a way that reduces American leverage over Canadian policy for a generation. Infrastructure once built shapes political economy. Pipelines built to tide waters stay built. LG terminals constructed to serve European and Asian markets do not get decommissioned because bilateral relations improve. Supply agreements with Germany and Japan, once operationalized, create their own constituencies and their own renewal incentives. If the Energy East pipeline is built, Alberta crude reaches Atlantic export terminals and the European market becomes a genuine alternative customer for Canadian oil. That permanently reduces the pricing power that American refiners have exercised over Canadian crude because American geography made it historically the easiest market to reach. If the Gold BO LNG terminal is constructed and the European supply agreements are executed, Canadian natural gas has a global market, not a continental one that permanently changes Canada's negotiating position on every future bilateral energy discussion. These are not outcomes that a future administration can reverse with a policy announcement. They are physical and commercial facts. Carney's declaration was designed to create exactly those facts as quickly and irreversibly as possible. While the political window created by Trump's confrontational approach remained open enough to generate Canadian domestic political support for the investment required, the Canadian public is supporting Carney's declaration. A poll conducted by Legger Polling on March the 17th and 18th found that 71% of Canadians supported the Sovereign Energy Declaration, including 64% of Conservative Party voters, a number that reflects the degree to which Canadian economic sovereignty has become a cross-partisan value in a way that directly limits the political space available to any Canadian political actor who might otherwise argue for accommodation with Washington. This is causing visible alarm within segments of the American foreign policy and energy policy establishment that have historically had little reason to pay close attention to Canadian domestic politics. The Council on Foreign Relations published an emergency commentary on March 18th, noting that the combination of Atlantic LNG infrastructure, Pacific supply, agreements, and European market commitments represented a permanent shift in Canadian energy export orientation, and that American policymakers had a narrowing window to engage through diplomatic and treaty channels before the infrastructure decisions became irreversible. Stay with me, because what the next 30 to 60 days look like in the bond markets, in the energy futures markets, in the congressional hearing rooms, and in the bilateral diplomatic channel that Washington has apparently not yet chosen to open will determine whether this confrontation becomes the inflection point that permanently redraws North American energy geography. Here's what makes the administration's position even more extraordinary. 3 days after Trump's Truth Social reaction on March 20th, the governors of New York, Vermont, Maine, Minnesota, and Massachusetts sent a joint letter to the White House, made public simultaneously with its transmission, asking the administration to immediately suspend the 50% energy tariff threat and open direct negotiations with Ottawa before the governors were forced to explore emergency energy procurement alternatives that could further complicate bilateral relations. The letter was signed by governors from both parties. It was polite in tone and specific in substance. And it was by any reading a public declaration by American state executives that the administration's energy tariff threat was creating a domestic governance crisis that they could not manage without federal reversal. The White House has not responded publicly to that letter. Sources inside the administration describe the energy tariff question as one of the most fiercely contested debates currently unfolding in the West Wing. Economic advisors are warning in explicit terms that a 50% tariff on Canadian energy would translate directly into higher consumer prices, elevated industrial input costs, and increased volatility in already sensitive regional energy markets. Those warnings are colliding head-on with the political instinct to project, resolve, and avoid appearing to retreat after a public threat. As of now, no final decision has been reached. The 30-day clock announced by Donald Trump is ticking, but this confrontation extends far beyond a tariff dispute between two neighboring governments. At stake is whether the physical architecture of North American energy pipelines, grid interconnections, refinery configurations, hydro contracts, and mineral supply chains built over half a century on the assumption of deep bilateral interdependence is now being deliberately redirected by sovereign policy choice. If Mark Carney executes the Sovereign Energy Declaration as announced, the American economy's relationship with Canadian energy will look fundamentally different 5 years from now, not because of a tweet, not because of a tariff headline, but because of infrastructure that will be financed, permitted, constructed, and locked into long-term contractual reality. If there are no strategic consequences for the confrontational approach that triggered this shift, the precedent becomes dangerous. Economic pressure against an integrated trading partner accelerates diversification, encourages alternative market formation, and reduces American leverage over time. That is not a tactical win. It is a compounding strategic loss. Here is where the situation stands. Canada has declared that the United States will no longer function as its default primary energy market. That declaration is being implemented through regulatory fast-tracking European and Indo-Pacific supply agreements and new export infrastructure planning. Meanwhile, Washington is debating whether to impose tariffs that its own energy industry groups, state governors, and internal economic advisors have flagged as economically self-defeating. Markets have already rendered an initial verdict. Instead of pricing in Canadian vulnerability, American energy futures reacted by pricing in tighter supply and higher domestic costs. Governors from energy-exposed states are publicly demanding negotiations. Industry associations are urging stabilization. Congressional committees are requesting classified briefings on critical mineral exposure, and Canadian public support for the declaration is consolidated into a broad national consensus. Watch the 30-day tariff deadline closely. Watch whether Alberta initiates formal approval steps on the Energy East corridor. Watch whether Atlantic LNG financing reaches final investment decision. Watch whether European offtake agreements move from framework to binding execution. These are the inflection points that determine whether this moment becomes temporary tension or permanent structural realignment. Because once infrastructure decisions cross certain thresholds, once contracts are signed, financing closes, construction begins, reversibility declines sharply, markets adapt, political constituencies form around new trade flows, leverage shifts. The central reality is this: Carney's strategy is grounded in physical economics. Trump's response so far has been grounded in tariff leverage. Markets respond more durably to the former than the latter. The tariff clock is running. The infrastructure clock is running faster. And the narrowing window to prevent a generational reshaping of North American energy geography is closing in real time.